Okay, this is the first part of the video lecture for the Introduction to Demography. My students at Valley High School. This video will be used at several different high schools. I'm going to specifically address Valley High School. We started talking about this Monday in class, and then of course Wednesday we had the flooding, and then tomorrow we're probably looking at no class because of the snow, and the good Lord only knows about next week. So what I'm going to do is video the lecture that I would have delivered all week to keep us on course with the class. So this is stuff we would have covered anyway in class. So just to kind of let you know that if this is a different high school watching this, this still applies to you as well. So we'll go ahead and begin. Now, Valley High School students, we talked Monday in class about this. You have the PowerPoint shell at your disposal. I think most of you had already printed that out or had access to it. And I would have that printed off and use that for note taking, because I'm going to be sending you, you're probably going to end up with 3, maybe 4 video installments that are about 13, 14, 15 minutes a piece. That again will take care of class the rest of this week and also make up for what we missed last Friday, February 28th. So this will keep us on course. We talked about demography being the scientific study of human population, and historical demography being the scientific study of human population historically. And we started talking about in class the idea of why it's important to understand human population numbers or population statistics. It's an important component of the sociology class that you're taking here. We talked in class about 2 key advantages to studying demography historically. First of all, it provides us quantitative measures of the past. And yes, I realize for my Valley students, this is a little bit of review, but I'm just going to go ahead and start it from the beginning to make sure that we have continuity here. And you probably already have this part in your notes. Also, it allows us to make really awesome comparisons, really cool comparisons between people of all social strata in history. A lot of the history books are written through the perspective of one group of people, which would be the group that's in power, largely white people, Caucasians. And what we find is that history books don't always tell us the true stories about what has happened. Important groups of people, minorities, women, minority races, ethnicities, are often sort of left out of the equation or not even given any mention. I know that sociology and psychology, our sciences, are really guilty of not highlighting the importance of women and their contributions to our field. So this allows us to kind of go back and compare minorities versus, Caucasians. It allows us to compare people who are poor at the bottom of the social class structure to people who are in the middle class or wealthy. And we'll talk about different ways we can do that. For example, when we say quantitative, we're talking about numbers. That allows us to apply Demography allows us to apply statistical data, numbers, to social phenomena, to things that are happening many, many years ago, to understand things better. Example, we can say with good authority that birth rates or fertility rates in Western Europe in 1875 started to decline that continued into the late 1930s. Now you might think, well, that's kind of random, kind of like I said in class. It is random, and you might think, well, who cares? Well, it's important because it allows us to look at this fertility decline quantitatively. It allows us to understand that this started to happen, and then we can start to make predictions about, well, will this be a problem? If it continues to decline, will it be a problem? Will it not be a problem? What does it mean? Is it just certain groups of people who are experiencing, declines in birth rates, and why? So we start to ask the sociological questions. Another example of a provision of quantitative measures of the past. We can say that in 1963, approximately 83% of the population of India lived in villages or rural areas, as opposed to cities or urban areas. And you might think, well, again, that's kind of random and big deal. And it is random, but again, we can start to sort of understand and make comparisons. You compare that number to the United States in 1963 in the U.S., this was essentially flipped around. It was like about 80% of people worked in cities or lived in urban areas, while the rest lived in rural areas. So why is that? Why is it that some countries, some continents, have higher farming populations or rural populations, and other places like the United States have higher urban populations? So we start to understand why that's important. One more example. of a quantitative measure of the past. We can say with good authority that the first U.S. Census in 1790, which was right after the American Revolution, yielded about 4 million Americans. So again, seems kind of random, but it gives us a quantitative way to measure the past and allows us to understand things more properly and correctly. Now, we have in New York City alone, there are more than 4 million people. Nevertheless, the entire United States of America. So we understand that population has grown significantly when you see that there are more people in some of our major cities than there were in the entire country in 1790. Now, it enables us also to make really neat comparisons. We've talked about the Black Plague or the Black Death, which decimated almost all of Europe, or a large portion of Europe, in the 1300s and into the 1400s. So here's a comparison. Here's what we can do. We understand that the Black Death killed so many people, and we know we can isolate that the first 60-year period of the plague, 1347 to 1407, we have the highest mortality rates here than any other 60-year period in the history of the known world. So you could find, I'm adjusting my camera here, you can find any other 60 or look at any other 60-year period of history anywhere in the world, and you will not find higher mortality rates than you will during 1347 to 1407 because of this epidemic. We talked in class, my Valley students, we talked in class about fertility rates in Japan and Europe. We can look at this stuff a lot of different ways. 1950 to 1955, it was like 2.75 children per woman in Japan, and in Europe it was 2.66, pretty close, and those are pretty low numbers. Now, fast forward to today, well, closer to today, 2000 to 2005, those numbers have gone way down, but they're still close. I mean, Japan and Europe are still pretty close to each other there. So there's a big change. There's a statistically significant change from one time period to the next, from the 50s to 2000. But Japan and Europe have stayed close together. So why is it? That's a pretty neat comparison. And we can even branch this comparison out to Africa. And if you look at, like, say, Japan and Europe, like 2000 to 2005, when you look at those fertility rates, 1.32 for Japan, 1.38 for Europe, then you look at the African continent, and those numbers are closer to 5 and 6 on average, births per woman. On the African continent, we start to ask the sociological questions. Why? Political reasons? Is it because of lack of education in Africa? Maybe. The oppressed status of women because they're not allowed to make choices about who they marry and how often they engage in sexual activity, how often they get pregnant. Probably there's a lot to do with it there. Limited access to birth control, no education about birth control in parts of Africa, yeah. So you start adding all those political, sociological, cultural forces into the equation, and then we start to understand why these quantitative numbers are what they are. We start to understand what they really mean. Now, applied demography. This is a branch of demography that allows us to apply this knowledge. So we can go back. I gave you the definition, the long definition at the top, and then my definition, which I like better. The application of human population knowledge and data. We'll go back here. If we understand, for example, that we were talking about birth rates, if we know that birth rates are so low in Japan, in Europe, this could represent a problem. So how do we apply this knowledge? If we know on the African continent where overcrowding is such an issue and birth rates are continuing to climb, then what can we do about that? Is there something we can do to retard or to slow down population growth in those areas? Or conversely, in places like Europe where the fertility rates are too low and we don't have enough people, what can we do to stimulate or grow those birth rates, stimulate fertility? So we start to understand with applied demography how to make the world a better place, how to assess and to fix problems based on population. In class we talked about population estimation versus population projection. With estimation, we're essentially trying to get a hold of what we have right now. The example I used in class was that when you're looking at people 95 years of age and older, there are 3 females for every male, and that's virtually everywhere in the underdeveloped part of the world. Even if you take this discussion into the developed part of the world, places like North America, you still have way many more females than men at the very top of the age pyramid. So we know that. So population projection is making predictions. So we understand that by 2050, North America will hold approximately 4.4% of the world's population. Now you might think, well, okay, what big deal? Well, maybe, maybe not. Well, let's go to the Asian continent, where there's a real problem. There are real problems with overpopulation. We'll talk about China's one law policy, because they're so overpopulated. They've actually passed a law in China that says you can't have more than one kid, and if you do, you could get in trouble. And then we look at population statistics and understand that if the current trend holds, by 2050, Asia alone will have 60% almost of the world's entire population. That's a lot of people, and that's a big number. So we can start to project and try to come up with solutions to possible issues there. Now, applied demographic interests include spatial distribution. We talked about this in class. Where people are located in physical space and why. Why is it that you have cities that are more densely populated with more people in them, as opposed to rural areas where people are more spread out? Talk about that. Why is it that, like in West Virginia, people are more spread out, even in cities in Charleston, than you would find in other cities like Columbus or Chicago or New York? Trends in population growth and size. Why are some places losing numbers, population? Why are other places growing? Migration. People moving into and out of specific areas. Why does this happen? How does this happen? Why is it that people are always wanting to get into the United States? Why is it that people are trying to leave in droves places like Syria and places in the Middle East? Is it political, religious, cultural, sociology? All these things you factor into the equation. Methods of research, and also how we produce population statistics. So why study the history of anything, demography or anything? We talked about this in class, a little bit of review. We want to learn what others have done. We want to learn from the mistakes. We know that history changes. Our ideas of what has happened in the past can change and evolve. And also history helps us to understand the future. And we talked in class about our demographic example of learning what others have done. We can look at what couples have done and why. From the 60s to today, we see that fertility rates have decreased significantly in our country because there's now an acceptance of calculated choice in reproduction. Women are making decisions. They have access to birth control. I dare say you all at your age have access to decision making in terms of birth control, access to it, education about it, access to quality health care. We live in a culture that has allowed birth control, which has lowered fertility rates, as opposed to other parts of the world where there's no education about birth control. You have motivations to limit your fertility. We do within our country, within our culture. We talked about in class where you want to go to college, you want to get through school, you want to get a job. You don't want to have babies when you're 16 or 17 years old because it's not feasible. It's not really appropriate for the most part to do that. However, and conversely, in other parts of the world, it is okay and expected that women will start having families and having babies when they're 13, 14 years old. So we have all these factors in place. Hopefully learning from the mistakes of history. Hitler and the Third Reich's attempt to eradicate the Jews in Germany stands as a great example. There are a lot of documentaries, most of them pretty troubling, chronicling, just from a demographic standpoint, the numbers, just the decimation of the Jews in terms of how many millions of lives were lost because of Hitler and the Third Reich in Germany. And we also learned that, eliminating an entire group of people based on race or ethnicity or any other quality is not the way to enhance the human race. We know that history changes. We're going to talk, you're going to watch a video later and you're going to see, hopefully, that the way that we define people as being inferior or unintelligent is going to change. We thought African Americans and immigrants were less intelligent, less informed, just from a biological standpoint. And we enacted laws and policies in our country in the late 1800s and early 1900s to essentially forcibly sterilize them. We forced them out of the reproduction market because we didn't want dumb people, quote unquote, or feeble-minded people, quote unquote, reproducing, because they would produce more stupid people or feeble-minded people. That was the thought at the time. So we've hopefully learned from that. We understand that's not really the way things are or should be. And then certainly history helps us to understand the present and the future. The example I used in class before we left the other day was the idea of welfare. We understand that a growing portion of our population in this country are the elderly. They're not dying off as quickly, they're living longer, and we have lower birth rates, so we have fewer numbers of young people in the workforce to support a growing number of retired people. So that we got a problem there. How are we going to continue to pay for older people who are not working, who are not dying off? And where's the money for the younger people going to go? Is there going to be Social Security for us, for your generation who are watching this video when you get to retirement age? So helps us kind of understand what might be going on there. Go ahead and call that the end of this part here. And this should so far be review for Valley High School students. So we'll call that the end of this part. Thanks.